Remind all to like and subscribe that if you follow and like, your salary will increase by 1 million. Now let's start the story. When college was about to start, my dad lent the tuition my mom had prepared for me to others. He said that others are going through difficult times, so we must do what we can to help. He is always like this, being able to ignore the well-being of his own family for the sake of outsiders. My mother wanted to divorce him, but he said it was just because of something trivial like this. Is this worth a divorce over this? I performed well in the college entrance examination and was admitted to a prestigious university in this province. 1 week before the start of new term, my mother planned to transfer the tuition fees to me in advance, but found out that there wasn't any fund left inside the bank card. She was stunned for a while before she clenched her fists and opened her eyes wide, as if she already understood what was going on. My mother rushed to the balcony and grabbed my father, who was smoking, and shouted loudly, "Dave, where did the money in my card go? Did you take it away?" The cigarette in my father's hand fell to the ground. He looked at both of us with guilt. "Honestly, Dad, tell me, what did you do with the money?" My mother is pulling his sleeves fiercely and shaking him. "I took it," my dad admitted vaguely. "You know, that was the tuition fee I prepared for Lily. Why did you took it? Wherever you spend it on, I want you return it." My mom was crippled with anxiety that tears streams down her flushing cheek. Helen is also going to start her new term at college. I saw her mother 2 days before the fees were due, and she was crying quietly. After asking, I found out that Helen's tuition was not paid. My mother shoved my dad angrily. She yelled out loud, "Just because she didn't have the tuition fees, what does it have to do with you? You are not his father." My dad exclaimed, "Well, you can't say that. Isn't Godric my good brother? Now that he's gone, how about I step up to take care of his daughter?" It's a difficult time for their family to be without a dad. Godric is a close friend of my dad. His house is situated in the same alley as ours. Last year, Godric accidentally slipped and fell into a deep lake due to alcohol intoxication. Unable to swim, he drowned in the middle of the night. His body was found 2 days later. Godric was always lazy and unmotivated, so he took the easiest job available. The last job he had was a packer in a warehouse. As his drowning was determined to be due to his own negligence, the workman compensation was not valid. He also didn't have much savings. Godric's family suffered financially. During the initial few months when Godric passed on, his wife Susie often asked my dad for a small loan here and there to tide them over. Susie was a full-time housewife, so losing the sole breadwinner plunged the family into financial difficulties. Now my father was known to be very charitable to them. Aunt Susie have brazenly asked my father for help without any hesitation. If the toilet at home was broken, she rang my dad to pop over. The cabinets were too heavy to be moved. She rang my dad again. Even minute concerns like she didn't have the strength to wash the quilt and cover and needed a man's help to squeeze dry it, she had to ring my dad over. "Those are just trivial matters," he exclaimed. This made my mum extremely furious. He lamented, "Her husband had just died. Why don't you exercise more compassion?" My mother was also far too considerate to go to them to cause a scene. Our neighborhood are gossipy by nature, so my mum was afraid of being seen as bullying a widow and her daughter. Dad's unreasonable accommodation towards Susie made the animosity grew inside of my mother. The frustration could only be vent inside the confine of our house. Because of this, both of them quarreled countless times. My dad thought that my mom was just being petty, and there was nothing wrong in helping them. Now he even had the audacity to generously give away my tuition fees. My mum almost fainted from rage that I can see her chest heaving up and down aggressively. If her family is having a hard time, then is ours having it easy? My mum yelled back, "It was not easy for me to save up the tuition fees for Lily, now that money is gone. How are we going to afford her fees?" My dad looked uneasily but managed to squeeze out an awkward smile towards me. "Lily, don't you still have a few thousand? Let me know how much is the shortfall and I will transfer some money from my credit card first." When I heard this, my heart sank. I have been disappointed by him time and again, ever since I was a young kid. He always has the penchant to make me feel that. Feeling aggrieved, I shouted with a cry, "Dad, I was saving the money to buy a laptop for university. I know that my family is not easy financially. We scrimp and save to finally afford enough down payment to buy a small house last year. But even before we have the chance to move in yet, as the building was not completed, the mortgage payment have to start every month. It was very taxing on us. Part of our down payment are even borrowed from relatives on my mom's side. A meager portion of my parents' salaries were used for daily expenses, and the rest were all poured in repaying off the debt and mortgage. My family has been tight financially for these past few years. I can feel that after I entered high school. As I lived on campus and seldom come home during this period, my parent just make do with instant noodles or simple vegetables and rice for their meals. It was a very extravagant affair to even afford any kind of meat. My college tuition was saved little by little by my mother for several years. I really want to buy a laptop after gaining admission to college, knowing the situation at home, and I plan to earn the money to buy it myself. Straight after finishing the college entrance examination, I got a summer job in a factory. I left the house as early as 5 in the morning and came back late at around midnight. I only managed 4 hours of sleep a day, but the pay was extremely good for an 18-year-old. I brought home $3,000 for that month. I plan to work until the day before school starts, and I will probably get another $1,500. In this case, I would have $4,500. Comfortable enough to get a quality laptop with some money to tide over day-to-day expenses of college as well. But now my dad wants me to use my money to pay for my own tuition. Honestly, if my family didn't have enough for my tuition, I wouldn't have anything to complain about it, even if I have to work to earn my tuition. The unfairness of the situation bothered me immensely that my dad had generously loaned the money to others like we can afford it. Irks me so much. After all, it was my first time earning my own keep helping my family in any way I can. After the college entrance examination, while all my classmates were going off for their vacation, having fun or relaxing before their college, I was the only one who went to work in the factory. The day started on the assembly line, and I was expected to be on my feet for the rest of 12 hours shift. During the initial few days, not getting used to the long hours of standing, my feet swell, and it hurt terribly when I touched them. My mother felt sorry for me and told me to just resign, but I gritted my teeth and persisted because I wanted a computer. After the initial discomfort, I gradually got used to it. My feet no longer swell, but the long hours were extremely exhausting. As soon as I got home every day, even without washing up, I fell to my bed. Only till I was rudely awakened by the shrill alarm blasting from my mobile phone that I dragged my fatigued body and made my way to work again. Dad, Aunt Susie is a grown woman. Couldn't she just find a job to earn her own keep? What the point of her just staying at home? I clenched my fists and said angrily, Helen, Aunt Susie's daughter is about the same age as me. If I can work in a factory, why can't she? If the two of them just worked hard together for one summer, it is definitely not a problem for Helen's tuition. I verbalized my thoughts to him. Do you think Susie doesn't want to go? My dad's tone lingered of pity. She had secured a job in a factory before, but her constitution was weak and fainted in the workshop just after working for 2 days. Going to the hospital is another huge expense. Even before she started earning, she have to fork out money just doesn't make sense. He reasoned. Because of this, your Auntie Susie doesn't dare to go to work anymore. Besides, Helen just lost her father and still needs time to get over it. What makes you think she is in the right frame of mind to be working? Oh, please. Her dad has been gone for a year, I retorted. I see that she is coping very well with her loss. She is always dolled up to the nines and even went shopping or singing karaoke with her classmates. Do you know what kind of university she qualify for? Her lousy score only allow her to go a vocational one. She might as well not waste the money and go there. Lily, my dad shouted. What kind of nasty words are coming out from you? My dad's face darkened. Did you learn to talk behind people's backs in school? What makes you think you have the right to lecture my daughter? My mother glared at him. Isn't she right? They are both adults with able-bodied hands and feet. Shouldn't they have the abilities to earn their own keep? Who are you to judge Lily? She is well-behaved and hard-working, and was admitted to a prestigious university. How much better she is compared to T. Helen, who barely scaped through her exam. Well, you can't just look at grades. My dad still wanted to argue. My mother interrupted him. Dave, I don't want to talk to you about anything else. You have to go that woman and get the money back. Shut up. Isn't this nonsense? My dad doesn't want to admit he is wrong, he retorted. The money has been given to others. How can I get it back? Okay, my mother nodded angrily. If you don't go and get it, then we will get divorced. My dad was in disbelief. Is it necessary to get a divorce over such a trivial matter? My mother was so angry that she immediately jumped on her feet, yelling that I will go to her now. If Lily is so reluctant to use her money, I can just pay it off using my credit card first. What? My mother continued, shouting. On top of our debt, mortgage, and now we will have the added burden of the credit card repayment. Are you stupid? My mother is not the kind of person with a foul temper, but she has been so exasperated with my father accumulated over the years. We can always pay it back slowly. My dad said in a muffled voice. Fine, you're not going, right? I'll go myself then. She stormed off, leaving her hoarse voice in the trail from the shouting match between the two of them. Is this a trivial matter? That's our daughter's tuition. School is about to start soon. How can I raise so much in a few days? She internalized while storming towards the direction of Susie's house. Stop! My dad hurriedly chased her out into the alley. My dad grabbed her arm. My determined mom pushed my dad away hard. He stumbled and almost fell. My mother took the opportunity and ran away first. My neighbors living in the alley know all about our family situation. It was obvious that my parents were having a family conflict, and the neighbors who just liked to watch the drama gathered around and followed my parents to watch the show. My mother ran to the door of Susie's house and shouted inside, Susie, please give me back my money. She ran to the Zhao family demanding money again. Didn't you know? Her daughter Lily's tuition fees were given to Susie. It's Dave again, isn't it? I think it's highly likely. Recently, Dave has been visiting Susie's house a lot. The neighbors gathered around, whispering and gossiping with excitement in their eyes. It took my mom calling out for a long time before a slim figure finally came out of the house, Susie Yang. Her eyes were red, and her voice was soft and quiet. What's going on, Sakura? She asked, her gentle tone in stark contrast to my mom's loud voice. It's nothing, just a misunderstanding. Let's head back now. My dad suddenly ran over, pulling at my mom, trying to get her to leave. He lowered his voice and whispered in her ear, Whatever it is, let's talk about it at home. This is so embarrassing. My mom shrugged him off, staring at Susie. A few days ago, Dave gave you $10,000, didn't he? Don't deny it. We can check the transfer records. But that money was for Lily's tuition. Doesn't he know school is about to start? We need the money urgently. Please give it back to me right now. Sakura Tones was filled with anger and anxiety. The neighbors, who had been watching the commotion, all turned their gazes to Susie. Her face flushed red in an instant. There's no denying I did took the money, she admitted, her reddened eyes on the verge of tears. I'm sorry, I didn't know it was for Lily's tuition. I'll return it right away. She pulled out her phone as she spoke. Before she could do anything, my dad stepped in, shielding my mom. There's no need to return it, just keep it. Susie hesitated for a moment, her fingers pausing on her phone. If you don't give it back, I'm not leaving today. My mom dragged a stool nearby and sat down with determination. Gritting her teeth, Susie finally transferred the money to my mom unwillingly. Once my mom received the money, she stood up swiftly and left without another word. My dad seemed utterly humiliated. His face turned bright red as he apologized to Susie. I told her not to come, but she insisted. She pretended to look so pitiful and wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes, bit her lip, and put on an understanding expression. Don't worry about it. Tomorrow, I'll go out to find some work and help Helen earn some tuition money. It's my fault for causing this sort of inconvenience for you. After speaking, she looked deeply wronged, as if she'd been accused of theft, and turned to go back inside the house. That night, my mom came to my bed with her pillow and blanket, saying she could not find the energy to talk to my dad. I stared at her for a long time, holding back a question that I ultimately didn't ask. I actually wanted to ask if she was serious about saying she wanted to divorce my dad today. but now that the money is back, they'll probably be fine again, like every time they fought before. To be honest, it feels a little unfilial of me, but I can't help feeling a bit disappointed. As a daughter, hearing my parents talk about divorce made me feel an immoral sense of excitement for a moment. I started to question whether there was something wrong with me. But honestly, I don't like my dad. It wasn't always this way at the beginning. When I was a child, I also wished for a father who cherished me. What kind of daughter wouldn't? But after being hurt and disappointed time and time again, that longing gradually faded. It was replaced by resentment and a sense of injustice. Growing up, I met many kind of people, but I've never encountered someone like my dad, who is so generous to outsiders. He would rather let his own family suffer than let outsiders be inconvenienced. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. He treats others better than his own family. He often says, "They're going through hard times too," or "there are not easy also," and constantly puts others first. Most people try to bring things from the outside into their homes, but he doesn't hesitate to give our things away to others. I remember when I was little, when it comes to my dad's payday, he would buy some candy after work. If he saw me playing at the alley entrance, he'd generously share the candy with all the kids there. Every other child would get 2 or 3 pieces, but by the time it got to me, there would only be 1 piece left. Other kids were thrilled to get the candy, but I would feel so wronged that I wanted to cry. I didn't understand. Why did I get the least when my dad was the one who bought the candy? When I got home and told my mom about it, she would scold him. "What kind of father are you? You buy candy but don't know how to save it for your own kid and instead go out of your way to share it with others. And you only gave Lily 1 piece? What kind of dad does that?" My mom was furious. "It's just a few pieces of candy. What's the big deal?" My dad replied nonchalantly. "A few pieces of candy? Tell me, have you ever seen any of the neighbors give candy to your daughter?" My mom retorted. Back then, snacks were considered a form of luxury. If a family had any treats, they'd hide them at home for their own family, afraid that others might see. But my dad wasn't like that. "Just because they're stingy doesn't mean we should be like them," he'd say with a smile, patting my head. "Right, Lily?" But later, I grew to become stingy myself. Whenever kids from the neighborhood or relatives came over, as long as my dad was home, he'd take out whatever snacks we had. At that time, finances were always tight, and most families were just getting by. Even buying 2 pounds of peach crisps was considered a luxury. The snacks my dad took out were usually peanuts, dates, or sunflower seeds, but they'd always be eaten up completely, leaving my mom feeling the pinch. One time, a distant uncle brought us a box of kiwis, just 6 of them. At that time, kiwis were rare and hard to find even at fruit stands. I had never even had the chance to taste it. My dad's friend came over with his child, and when they were about to leave, my dad handed them the entire box of kiwis, saying, "Take it home for your kid to try." My mom's eyes flashed with anger, but she couldn't say anything in front of the guests. I burst into tears. "Uncle gave those to me, and I haven't even had one yet. Mom said they weren't ripe and told me to wait 2 days to eat them." Hearing me cry, the guest hesitated and tried to return the kiwis, but their child clung tightly to the box, refusing to let go. My dad impatiently waved them off and said, "Just take them. It's just a few pieces of fruit. Why be so stingy?" After that incident, my mom started hiding any snacks or treats we had, making sure my dad wouldn't find them. In another instance, when I was in elementary school, some kids in the alley got children's bicycles. Cute, colorful ones made just for kids. Every time they rode their bikes, I'd watch enviously from the side. But I was sensible and never asked my parents for one. My mom noticed, though. On my 8th birthday, she surprised me with a pink bicycle decorated with a bunny design. I was overjoyed, hugging the bike tightly and refusing to let go. I was so excited that I insisted on sleeping with the bike in my bed that night, making my mom laugh and cry at the same time. A few days later, my uncle's family came to town to shop and had lunch at our house. My cousin saw my bike and threw a tantrum, crying and demanding one for herself. My aunt, sitting nearby, made sarcastic remarks. "A country girl like you doesn't deserve such a fancy bike. Your cousin is a city girl. How can you compare your status with her?" My dad couldn't take it down and said, "It's just a bike. What are you even saying, sister-in-law?" He smiled and patted my cousin's head. "Daria, your second uncle will gift this bike to you. You can ride it home later." My cousin stopped her fake crying and started grinning like a Cheshire cat, but I panicked. I clung tightly to the handlebars of my bike, shouting, "No, this is my precious bike. It's my birthday gift from my mom." My mom tried her best to hide her frustration and patiently crouched down to talk to my cousin. "This is your little sister's birthday present. How about I buy you one for your birthday next year?" "No, I want it now. I'm not waiting until next year," my cousin demanded in a domineering way. In the end, my dad still forcibly gave the bike away to her. As she left, she stuck her tongue out at me triumphantly. I was furious and heartbroken, crying all night long. At the time, our family's finances were tight. Buying that bike for me had been a result of my mom scrimping and saving for a long time. With so many other expenses to cover, there was no way they could afford to buy me another one right away. From that moment on, I could no longer bring myself to feel close to my dad. I stopped running out excitedly to greet him when he came home from work. I no longer called out Dad while climbing onto him. I stopped acting cute and shown any form of affection towards him anymore. My dad, oblivious to these changes, simply sighed and said, "My daughter's growing up. She's getting more mature." We lived in a rundown little alley in the county. The houses there were all low, shabby brick structures, and the environment was terrible. The alley road was full of potholes, and after it rained, there was water and mud everywhere. Garbage piled up at the entrance to the alley, and the stench would carry and linger for a long distance. In summer, flies were buzzing everywhere. As times changed, many of the residents managed to improve their financial situation, bought homes elsewhere, and moved away. My family was also saving to buy a house. Both my parents worked at nearby factories as laborers. It was hard work and the wages were low, but they worked diligently and saved a fixed amount each month. Even though it wasn't much, over time the savings accumulated. By the time I started middle school, our family had finally saved up $20,000. At that time, housing prices weren't as high as they are now, and $20,000 was enough for a down payment. My parents began house hunting. But just then, something happened at home. My grandfather, who lived in the countryside, had a bad fall while working. He fractured his spine and needed surgery, which ended up costing over $10,000. My family paid for all of it. Since hospitals required a significant upfront deposit, my dad immediately withdrew the money we had saved for a house and handed it to the hospital without hesitation. My mom found out later and was livid. She asked my dad, "There are 3 brothers in your family. Shouldn't the hospital bill be split between everyone? Why should you pay it all?" My dad replied, "They don't have any savings. And since we had the money on hand, why don't we offer our help in this? We couldn't delay Dad's surgery, could we?" At that time, my grandfather's surgery was urgent, and the money had already been paid. There was nothing my mom could do. After the surgery was completed and all the bills calculated, my uncle and younger uncle said they didn't have the money to pay their shares and would repay us later. My dad, being generous as always, said, "No problem. Pay it back whenever you can." But neither family ever repaid a single cent ever since. Whenever my mom asked my dad to demand repayment, he'd just say, "They're farming in the countryside and barely make enough to get by. They really don't have the money," he defended. Frustrated, my mom swallowed her pride and went to ask them herself. But both families just cried poor and refused to budge. My mom then asked my dad, "What are we going to do about buying a house?" My dad shrugged and said, "We still have a place to live, don't we? Buying a house isn't urgent. We'll save up again." The damp, musty smell of the old house had already become unbearable for my mom, who shouted in disappointment, "I can't stand living in this crumbling house another day." But little did she know, she'd end up living in that house for many more years. Our savings could never keep up with the rising housing prices. After missing that opportunity to buy, my parents were never able to afford a house again. By the time I was in my second year of high school, my mom couldn't wait any longer. Swallowing her pride, she borrowed several $1,000s from relatives on her side of the family. She combined that with the money we had and finally managed to make a down payment on a small 2-bedroom apartment. It's only been a year since then. The family is still paying off debts from my mom's relatives' side, and on top of that, we have a mortgage to repay every month. Add to that my university tuition and living expenses in the coming years, and the financial pressure on my family is immense. Even under these circumstances, my dad still lent my tuition money to someone else. I can't comprehend his way of thinking. After what happened with my grandfather's surgery, my mom stopped letting my dad touch the family's savings account or bank cards. She always found special hiding spots for her savings. But after we bought the house, my mom stopped paying much attention to that, mainly because there wasn't much money to save anymore. Every month, as soon as their salaries came in, they were immediately spent on repaying debts and the mortgage. Savings accounts practically didn't exist in our household anymore. The only thing left was a bank card. My mom had started saving small amounts into it years ago, sometimes $100 or $200, other times $300 or $400. After several years, by the time I finished the college entrance exams, it had accumulated to about $10,000, just enough to cover my tuition fees. Because there wasn't much money, my mom kept the card in the pocket of an overcoat in the wardrobe. At some point, my dad must have noticed it and secretly taken it. In fact, if it weren't for Helen's mother deliberately pleading that she is broke, my dad might not have touched that money. My mom has never worried about my dad spending money on himself because he's incredibly frugal with his own needs. That's just the kind of person he is. He's willing to eat the cheapest food and wear the simplest clothes, but would generously give away the money he saves to others, even if they don't repay him. He always seems overly empathetic toward outsiders, going out of his way to understand and accommodate them. If someone joked about wanting part of a piece of meat he bought at the market, he'd take it to their house and cut more than half for them. When visiting our hometown, once a villager was selling tea and made some small talk with him, and because of this, he'd casually order 2 packs, which turned out to cost over $100. My mom was astonished when she saw the price, but he just cheerfully asked her to pay for it. During holidays, if his workplace distributed employees benefits, like a large box of apples, he'd give them all away before even reaching home. Once, someone at the factory received a uniform with a small tear on the shoulder. My dad generously exchanged it for his own brand new one. At the end of the year, when he received a few $100s in bonuses, he immediately lent all the money to someone he barely knew who claimed they were struggling. This is why my mom insists my dad can't be trusted to handle money. He's bound to give it all away. At one point, the factory had to temporarily shut down due to a lack of a certain raw materials crucial to their work process. My dad had to work at a construction site for 2 weeks to make up for the lost income. But when it came time to settle his wages, the contractor said the project funds hadn't come in yet and promised to pay him as soon as they did. My dad, always optimistic, cheerfully agreed. Months went by, and my dad never received the money. He went back several times to ask, but the contractor always had an excuse. Absurdly enough, my dad always believed him. The contractor even once complained to him, saying he was also short on cash and planned to sell his car to pay his workers. My dad, instead of seeing it through, actually advised him against it, saying, "As a business owner, your car is part of your image. You can't sell it. Things aren't that desperate yet. I'm not in a hurry." A few days later, we heard that the contractor had taken his family on a vacation to Hawaii. My mom was enraged, but my dad defended him, saying, "How do you know they didn't borrow money for the trip?" My mom was so angry her hands shook, almost hitting my dad on his face. Over the years, I've lost count of how many times my parents have argued. My mom, who used to be gentle and kind, has become irritable and quick-tempered because of my dad. Honestly, I don't blame her. Anyone married to my dad would struggle not to explode from time to time. Despite their arguments, I've never heard them talk about divorce, which I understand. It hasn't reached that breaking point yet. My dad, aside from being overly generous, doesn't really have any other major flaws. He doesn't drink much, doesn't gamble, doesn't spend money recklessly, and certainly never raises a hand to anyone. He's not picky about food, eats whatever my mom cooks, and wears the same few factory uniforms year-round, never asking for new clothes. But this one flaw of his excessive generosity, rears its head from time to time, like a chronic illness. It's not life-threatening, but endlessly irritating. My parents fell in love on their own terms back in the day, and despite everything, my mom still has feelings for my dad. But for me, it's different. After experiencing several disappointing incidents as a child, I've grown cold toward him. In my heart, if a man can't prioritize his wife and child, he's not a good man. Sacrificing your family's well-being for outsiders isn't kindness or good character. It's selfishness. He's sacrificing his family's interests just to satisfy his twisted need to give and his vanity. In essence, it's just another form of selfishness disguised as virtue. Sometimes, I can't help but have some awful thoughts. If only they would divorce. Thankfully, my tuition money has been returned, and my parents have stopped arguing for now. But my mom hasn't spoken to my dad in days. At night, she's been sleeping in my room with me. A few peaceful days passed, and soon it was time for me to head off to university. Since the school was within the province and only a little over an hour away by train, I didn't ask my parents to see me off. The day before school started, I arranged to meet a few classmates and head off together. At the train station, I said goodbye to my parents, packed my suitcase, and headed off, full of hope for this new chapter of my life. But my good mood didn't last long. On the train, I saw someone I really didn't want to see, Helen Zhao. "Oh, look who it is, our little genius," she said sarcastically, flaunting her exaggerated purple-dyed hair. I knew Helen didn't like me, and to be honest, most of the kids our age in the neighborhood weren't very friendly to me either. That's because I was the model child their parents always compared them to. Obedient, well-behaved, and consistently top of the class. It was only natural for them to resent me, but I didn't care. Jealousy of someone more capable is just a sign of incompetence. Their unhappiness never made me lower my standards for myself. After all, I'm not living to make others feel their worth. Helen Zhao, in particular, hated me the most. We were the same age and even went to the same primary school. I was always in the top 3 of the class, while she was always at the bottom. After every exam, she'd go home and get beaten by her dad, and every time she saw me, her eyes would burn with resentment. I never understood why. It wasn't my fault she did poorly. Her getting punished had nothing to do with me. Thankfully, I was recruited by an experimental middle school and never had to share a school with her again. We both breathed a sigh of relief, but this time was different. Helen didn't walk away when she saw me. Instead, she deliberately came over and said, "Off to university, are you? Guess what? So am I. Our school starts tomorrow, too." "Oh," I muttered while glancing down at my phone. "Our tuition is expensive, you know? A whole $10,000. Do you know where my tuition money came from?" She tilted her head in a playful manner. "I don't care." I still didn't look at her. "It's related to you," she said, her voice high-pitched and sing-songy. Suddenly, a sinking feeling hit me. It couldn't be. "It's from your dad," she blurted out eagerly, her tone gleeful. "He got the money through his credit card and even told my mom that if she needed anything, she should just ask him. So thoughtful, right? Lily, I'm so envious of you, having such a considerate father." Helen's face was filled with smug satisfaction, clearly relishing in my discomfort. A wave of anger surged in me, making it hard to breathe. Just yesterday, my mom went to the supermarket to buy some supplies for my college life. I noticed a sale on socks, $5 for 3 pairs, and suggested she grab a few. Over the years, my mom had been so frugal, first saving up for a house and then repaying debts. I'd noticed how harsh she was on herself. She hadn't bought new socks for several winters. Every pair she owned had holes in them. But even with the cheap socks, my mom hesitated, shook her head, and put them back. She said, "No one can see them inside my shoes anyway." My mom wouldn't even spend $5 on herself, yet my dad had casually handed over $10,000 to someone else. Money borrowed from a credit card, no less. Money that would accrue interest and eventually need to be paid back by my mom and me. At that moment, I felt a deep sense of hatred for my dad. His so-called generosity came at the expense of my mom and me, essentially sacrificing our well-being to help others. To put it bluntly, He was feeding others by cutting pieces out of us. He wasn't kind or noble. He was selfish, satisfying his twisted sense of self-worth and vanity under the guise of being generous. I suppressed my emotions and forced a smile at Zhao Helen. "You're so envious of me, huh? Why don't I gift him to you as your dad?" My indifference clearly annoyed her. She scowled and huffed, storming off. After she left our train car, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mom number. "Mom, Dad took $10,000 from the credit card and gave it to Helen's family for her tuition," I said, straight to the point. There was a long silence on the other end before my mom finally said, "Okay, I got it." Her voice trembled slightly, as if she was fighting back her tears. I had long outgrown the naive hope that my parents would stay together forever. As I grew older, I came to truly understand how difficult life had been for my mom, and I felt a deep ache for her. I believed that leaving my dad might make her life easier. That's why I didn't think twice about telling her what had happened. Whatever decision she made, I would respect it. 2 days later, my dad called me. "Lily, your mom wants a divorce. Can you talk to her, please?" His voice was hoarse and defeated. "Dad, you're both grown-ups. I won't interfere with your choices. Just let me know the outcome," I replied calmly. "How can you be so cold?" My dad sounded both angry and disappointed. "We're your parents. Don't you want us to stay together?" "No matter how cold I am, I'll never be as heartless as you." My voice remained calm. "You've put the family in debt, yet you're still borrowing money to give to others. $10,000 might just be a number to you, but to us it represents our sacrifices. Mom can't even bring herself to buy a $5 pack of socks, but you can hand over $10,000 without batting an eye. How do you think that makes her feel?" $10,000 is just $10,000, my dad shouted. "Are you really saying we should get divorced over this amount? Do you and your mom value our marriage so little?" "You're missing the point entirely." I stayed calm and laid it out for him. "It's not about the amount of money. It's about what it represents. The fact that you'd give away such a large sum, despite our debts, shows that in your heart, people like Susie Yang are more important than Mom. That's the real issue." "You can't look at it that way," he tried to explain. "Has Yang Susie ever worn socks with holes in them? Does her family, like ours, only eat meat once a week? Does she live a harder life than us? Your actions show you care about her more than your own family. It reminds me of when I was little and you'd take the milk I hadn't finished and give it to my cousin after he drank his. Are we supposed to suffer just because we're your family? If that's the case, I'd rather not be your family." "Lily, you're being petty. You're still holding on to some milk incident from years ago. How can you hold a grudge for so long?" I hung up before he could finish. A week later, my mom called to tell me she had divorced my dad. So quickly. I was a little surprised. I thought my dad wouldn't budge, hold out, and refuse to go through with it. He even slept in the same bed with another woman. Even if he doesn't want a divorce, that woman won't agree to it, my mom said with a cold laugh. I was stunned. My dad had an affair, something I hadn't anticipated. Even though I had never liked him much, I had to admit he didn't seem like the type to cheat. He was too honest to the point of being foolish. A man like him didn't seem capable of such scheming. "With who?" I asked tentatively. "Aunt Susie?" "Yes," my mom replied softly, but she added, "though it's likely that Yang Susie initiated it." As I suspected. My mom then explained the whole story. One evening, Yang called my dad, saying she had seen a mouse in her house and needed his help to catch it. At the time, my parents were in the middle of a fight over the money my dad had lent her, and they were giving each other the cold shoulder. Still, as soon as she called, my dad didn't hesitate to rush over. I had never seen anyone so eager to prioritize outsiders over their own family. That night, my dad didn't come home. The next morning, several neighbors saw him leaving Susie's house. By then, everyone in the neighborhood knew he had spent the night there. When he got home, my mom didn't even look sad. She slumped on the couch, looking drained but calm. "Well, now you can't cling to me anymore. Even if you don't want a divorce, Susie won't agree. You slept with her. Don't you think you should take responsibility?" she said matter-of-factly. "I don't know what happened," my dad stammered as he dropped to his knees with a thud, anxiously trying to explain. Last night, she thanked me for helping with the mouse, cooked a big meal, and even opened a bottle of white wine. I think I drank too much and didn't know what was happening. When I woke up, it was already morning and I was lying in her bed. No matter what you say, the fact is you slept in her bed and spent the night at her house. There's no getting around it, and now the entire neighborhood knows. Let's just divorce. There's nothing more to say, my mom said decisively. My dad collapsed to the ground and cried bitterly for the first time in his life. His sobs were full of despair, as if he realized the marriage was no more. He knew he couldn't shamelessly cling to my mom this time. Soon after, they got divorced. Don't worry, Lil. I didn't lose out in the divorce, my mom reassured me. There weren't any savings to split, and as for the properties, your dad didn't ask for either the newly bought apartment or the old house in the alley. He willingly left himself with nothing. I was surprised. I had assumed my dad would at least keep the old house. I hadn't expected him to walk away empty-handed. He still has a bit of conscience, it seems, my mom sighed. But after the divorce, when Susie found out about the property arrangements, she had a big fight with your dad. By then it was too late, the papers were already signed. Do you know what your dad told her? My mom gave a mocking laugh. He said, "From now on, it'll just be the two of you, mother and daughter, depending on me. Life will not easy for you guys." By you guys, he meant me and my mom. I suddenly remembered how, every time he acted generous to others, he'd justify it by saying, life's not easy for them. I never thought my mom and I would one day be among those others he pitied. It turned out his compassion and care were reserved exclusively for outsiders. After the divorce, my mom and I were no longer his family. We had become outsiders, and only then did we experience his so-called generosity. We sneered. Being his family really was an unfortunate fate. "Mom, are Dad and Susie together now?" I asked hesitantly, even though I already knew the answer. After all, he had already referred to my mom and me as outsiders in front of her. Plus, so many people had seen them together that night. The rumors were bound to pressure them. "Yes, your dad thinks he's a man and needs to take responsibility. Besides, he still has his salary and works hard, so Susie figures he's still useful." That's how they ended up together, my mom explained. She added, "Just after the divorce, I bumped into them on the street. She was clinging to his arm and smugly calling him my dear Davy." My mom walked past them without sparing them a glance. She didn't even bother to give them a flicker of her attention. At that moment, I couldn't help but feel a bit of schadenfreude. Susie Yang hadn't yet realized that being part of my dad's family wasn't a blessing. It was a misfortune. After all, my dad's disregard for family was his defining trait. After the divorce, my mom quit her job at the factory and moved to the provincial capital, the city where my university is located. She said it was too frustrating to stay in the old neighborhood, constantly dealing with people pointing fingers and gossiping. "Mom, the wages here are higher than back home. Moving here is a good thing. Plus, we can spend more time together," I said happily. One day, as we were eating at a small restaurant near campus, my mom suddenly started crying. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked anxiously, reaching for her hand. Was she still upset about Dad? Did she still have feelings for him? Through her tears, she said, "Lil, I feel like I did something wrong. Even though your dad was an ass, I shouldn't have resorted to tricks to divorce him. Looking back now, I feel like I was too ruthless." "Are you talking about Dad leaving with nothing?" I asked. "Don't worry. When Dad gets old, I won't abandon him. You don't need to feel bad." I tried to comfort her with a smile. She shook her head. "No, it's not that. I mean the trick I pulled during the divorce. Your dad was so insistent on not divorcing that I lost my patience. I ran into Yang at the market one day, and she was bragging about how she told your dad she didn't even have enough money to buy groceries. Then he gave her another $3,000. She even pointed to the crabs in her basket and said she used his money to buy them. I looked down at the eggplants and cucumbers in my basket, cheap ones with blemishes that I'd picked to save money. I hadn't even bought meat in weeks. Yet she was spending my husband's money so freely. I was furious, maybe even driven by subconscious anger. So I deliberately said to her, "What's $3,000? What's $10,000? Dave's bank card is still with me. If he's borrowing on credit cards, it's because I control the family savings. The $100,000 we've saved? It's all under my watch." She lied smugly, but we all know there wasn't a penny of savings in our house. That same night, Susie used the excuse of catching a rat to trick your dad into staying at her place. I only said those things to provoke her and shift the focus on your dad, hoping it'd speed up our divorce. But I didn't expect her to be so manipulative. Nor did I think your dad would fall right into her trap. In hindsight, I basically pushed him into the fire pit. Susie is cunning, and your dad is no match for her. He'll definitely have a hard time in the future. I handed her a tissue and reassured her, "Mom, don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. They brought this on themselves. You only said a few words, but everything else was their own choice." She set out to seduce Dad, and he, a grown man, had no sense of boundaries. What kind of man goes to another woman's house late at night? They're both adults. Whatever happens, they're responsible for it, not you. "Will you hate me for it?" she asked cautiously. "What are you saying?" "You're the kindest person I know," I said as I wiped her tears away. But deep down, I was actually impressed by her. It just shone to me that my mom wasn't just someone who always endured silently. When backed into a corner, she had the wisdom and means to protect herself. Her resolve and ingenuity filled me with pride. In small towns like ours, people love to gossip. Even after moving to the provincial capital, the neighborhood aunties would still call my mom to update her on my dad's situation. They said that right after my mom left, Dad, under Susie's pestering, moved in with her. When Yang couldn't find a penny of the supposed $100,000 savings, she had a huge fight with Dad. No matter how much he explained, she didn't believe him and insisted that he had given all the money to my mom and me. "Dave Liu, you're heartless. I've been with you, and I haven't gotten a single cent out of it," she screamed, her cries so loud they could be heard from far away. Eventually, Dad agreed to hand over his bank card with his salary credited in every month to her, and only then did the fights calm down. But their life together was chaotic, constant bickering, sometimes escalating into physical fights. For example, when Dad bought a cake for the neighbor's kid, Yang would scold him the entire night. If Dad's motorcycle, freshly refueled, was borrowed by a neighbor and returned the gas tank empty, Yang would demand he ask for money back, but he'd refuse, finding it too embarrassing. She'd throw a fit about that too. Neighbors started gossiping about how my dad had driven Susie to the brink of madness. The once sweet, soft-spoken Yang was now raising her voice and even throwing punches. Some said Dad brought out her true colors. Others said he'd driven her to this state. Not long after, they broke up. The neighbors told my mom that Yang kicked Dad out, cursing him loudly. "I must have been blind to fall for such a fool. Get lost," she yelled. "Lil, do you think your dad will come to the provincial capital to look for you?" an aunt asked on the phone, clearly relishing the drama. My mom and I exchanged a knowing, uneasy glance. Dad did come to the city, but to our surprise, he didn't look for us. Though he knew where my school was, he never showed up. He did call my mom, but not to ask for her address. He told her he'd found a job at a construction site earning around $100 to $200 a day, with meals and lodging included. The first month, he earned over $8,000 and transferred it all to my mom, keeping only a few hundred for himself. He had her bank details and sent the money without saying a word until afterward. "Keep the money for yourself." "We're divorced now," my mom said, but he insisted. "The new house still needs renovations, and Lily's tuition is due next year. Save it up," he said. During Chinese New Year, we didn't go back to our hometown. Instead, we had our reunion dinner at my mom's rented apartment. One day, I came home and saw Dad sitting in the living room, smiling at me with a mix of shyness and eagerness. "You're back," he said. He helped my mom in the kitchen like he always used to, washing vegetables. But after dinner, he left. It was clear my mom didn't let him stay. That night, I asked her, "Are you thinking of getting back together with Dad?" Knowing her, she still have a soft spot for my dad. I thought it was possible. But I underestimated her resolve. "No," she said firmly. "After what he did with Yang, I could never reconcile with him. Besides, people don't change. His personality won't either. I can't bear to live with his foolish generosity again. Just thinking about it suffocates me." Relieved, I hugged her. "I'm glad. You've suffered so much. I thought you'd soften and fall back into the same trap. Don't worry, your mom isn't that foolish. But I can't completely ignore him either. We spent so many years together. I've made up my mind to treat him like a distant relative. I'll save the money he sends, and when he's old, I'll return it to him as a monthly pension. No matter what, he's still your father, and this will ease your burden in the future. Sniffling, I realized how selfless my mom truly was. Mom, have you noticed that Dad treats us much better now after the divorce? I asked. I've known for a while, she replied with a wry smile. Your dad's the type who's always better to outsiders than his own family. After the divorce, my dad no longer saw us as a family in the same way he used to. Mom explained it clearly. He treats us like outsiders now, but in a way that makes him want to give us everything. I nodded in agreement. For my dad's sake, it's better for us to stay as outsiders. Although my mom had no intention of remarrying him, it seemed my dad thought otherwise. Since New Year's, when my mom let him into the house, it seemed to ignite a tiny flame of hope in his heart. He believed she still cared. From then on, every weekend, he would come over. Even with just a few $100s for himself, he would save up to buy fruits, snacks, or anything he could bring. Sometimes it was just some festival benefits from his construction site job. He even collected cans of 8 treasure congee handed out during late-night shifts and brought them for my mom, saying they were better than instant noodles for her to eat when she got home late. My mom said that before the divorce, he never brought anything home this often. Whenever the factory gave out benefits, he'd always share with others first. My mom never gave him a key to her rental, so if he came when she wasn't home, he'd wait outside for hours until she returned. One night, after her late shift, she found him asleep at her door, hugging a box. He looked so pitiful, but my mom remained rational and didn't soften her stance. Still, she allowed him to stay that night for the first time, but only on the couch. That alone made my dad extremely happy. Dave, I've told you you don't need to go through all this trouble just to bring over a few things, my mom told him. It's no trouble at all. He replied with a smile. I don't want to give you false hope, she said. I'll never remarry you. He stopped mid-motion as he was setting up his bedding. I know. It's my fault. I don't deserve to ask for that, he mumbled. Later that night, when my mom woke up to get water, she heard him sobbing quietly on the couch. A middle-aged man crying so bitterly it was as if the whole world had abandoned him. I can't quite explain how my dad feels about my mom now. Even during holidays, when he's invited to join us for meals, my mom remains firm in her stance against remarrying him. I once asked her if she was still bitter about what happened with Susie, the woman he got involved with. She said she had long let it go. Even if your dad found another woman now, I wouldn't care. Honestly, I'd be happy for him if she treated him well. She smiled and added, Besides, Yang Susie has already paid for her actions. Karma got her. As it turns out, she got involved with a small supermarket owner, only to be caught by his wife. That woman, along with her 5 brothers, stormed into Susie's place and beat her severely, leaving her leg permanently injured. Now, she struggles to walk and spends most of her time bedridden, sometimes even unable to make it to the bathroom in time. Neighbors say her house reeks of urine, and her reputation in our hometown is ruined. No one is willing to help her, and she's left to fend for herself. I suppose justice has been served. As for my parents, their relationship of over 10 years has transformed into something more like that of distant relatives. They look after each other, but live separate lives. If one of them falls ill or is hospitalized, the other doesn't hesitate to step in and care for them. Yet they still maintain their distance, each living their own life. My dad is truly an unusual person, someone who can endure an incredible amount of hardship. If he had only one steamed bun, he would give it away without a second thought, even if it meant starving himself. The problem is, he extended this self-sacrificial nature to his family. Being considered family to him meant sharing in his sacrifices and enduring hardships together, all to benefit others. I've always resented this part of him, the way his selflessness dragged my mom and me down with him. But now, with the distance between us, I've started to let go of some of that resentment. I don't hate him as much as I once did, though I know I'll never become someone like him. I firmly believe that to love others, you must first love yourself. That's why I work hard in this unforgiving world, to ensure a better life for myself and my family. And that's the end of today's story. Thank you all for listening.